Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Kalina. I'm the Policy Director of Ploughshares Fund. It is it's great to be here, and it's great to see all of you here. It's just a fabulous day for us, and thank you all for making it possible. It is my pleasure to be sandwiched between Senator Markey and Congressman Lieu. These two great leaders are taking the lead, as you all know, on legislation to limit President Trump and any president's ability to launch nuclear weapons without approval from Congress. And this year they have teamed up to reintroduce their legislation, as you've heard, the Restricting First Use of Nuclear Weapons Act. This legislation, let me just say, more than any other, has really energized and focused our community. This year, when there's so many different things to fight on so many different fronts, this legislation really is a crystal clear beacon of one of the key things we have to do, and their leadership has been so essential on this point, and we can't thank them enough. And specifically on Congressman Lieu, you know, it's hard to believe that Congressman Ted Lieu was first elected just 3 years ago. In that short time, not only has he attracted legions of Twitter followers, and if you don't follow him on Twitter, you should, because you'll not only learn things, but you'll have a good chuckle every now and then, and he's just killing it. But he's established himself on a leader on so many issues, including nuclear weapons, that he's just a pleasure to have in Congress and a pleasure for us to know, and it is my pleasure to introduce Congressman Ted Lieu.
Oh, good morning, and thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Joe, for your leadership. And let's give Joe a tremendous round of applause. All right. I also want to recognize Secretary Perry. Many years ago, I was a student in his class. I really like him still because he gave me an A. So thank you, Secretary Perry. And to Senator Markey, who was an amazing leader for many years on the nuclear issue, and also Senator Feinstein, who is a co-author of the legislation. So I'm going to talk about the legal basis for the legislation, and then I'll talk about the light topic of North Korea. So many of you already know what it takes to launch a nuclear weapon in America, but I think it's important to just remind ourselves of how easy it is. So when you look at it, you need the approval of the National Command Authority, which sounds really impressive until you read it. It's two people. It's the President of the United States and his political appointee, the Secretary of Defense. And under the law, the Secretary of Defense cannot veto that order. It is a ministerial act. The Secretary of Defense is supposed to just execute it. So the President of the United States wakes up one day, decides to launch nuclear weapons, gives the order to the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Defense executes it, goes down military chain of command, and the missiles fly. It is that easy. No member of the judiciary is involved. No member of Congress is involved. No other member of the President's cabinet is involved. So Senator Markey and I looked at this and said, this is flat out unconstitutional. If you look at the Constitution, the framers went to great lengths to stop the President. They put an entire judiciary to stop the President. They put an entire Congress as a check and balance on the President. And then they gave the greatest power they knew at that time, the power to declare war, to Congress. There was no way they would have given one man the ability to launch thousands of nuclear warheads that can kill hundreds of millions of people in less than an hour and not have called that war. If you don't call that war, you've just read the term out of the Constitution. So, as Senator Markey said, our bill is very simple. It basically says to the President, before you launch your nuclear first strike, you need to get congressional authorization. When we first introduced it, we only had a handful of co-sponsors. Now, thanks to you, we have 65. And every time the President does something erratic, which is like every other day, we get more and more co-sponsors, and I'm very pleased there's now the bipartisan legislation to restrict the President from launching a nuclear first strike. It is H.R. 669 on the House side, and on the Senate side, it is Senate Bill 200. But there's another form of legal authority for this legislation, and that is the law of war, also known as the law of armed conflict. I served on active duty in the U.S. Air Force in the 1990s. One of my duties was to teach the law of armed conflict, and it's very clear that nuclear weapons violates multiple principles of the law of armed conflict. One of those is distinction. A nuclear weapon, by definition, cannot really distinguish between civilians and military combatants. It is an enormously large weapon that can kill a lot of people, including mostly civilians. It also violates the principle of proportionality, which basically says, look, you can't strike a target that has 200 civilians to get one bad person. The US military knows that. They're all trained to follow the law of war. And so the other reason we introduced this legislation is just to raise this issue, because all military members are trained from day one to follow the law, to follow the Constitution. We all took an oath to that, and to follow the law of armed conflict. And so we want military members to think twice, especially these top-level generals, that if order were to come down and they see really no reason, no attack from Russia, no attack from China, no reason for why we're launching nuclear weapons, that they think to themselves, is this a constitutional order, and is it in line with the law of armed conflict? And by raising awareness on this issue, hopefully we can get pushback within the administration itself. I am pleased that our Secretary of Defense appears to understand the risk of nuclear weapons, and he also understands the risks of North Korea, which I want to shift to right now. He himself has basically said there are no good military options in North Korea. When I was on active duty, one of my bases was Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. I was under US Pacific Air Forces. We did a series of different military exercises, many of them directed against North Korea. And it was very clear, we have exactly 0 good military options. And let me walk you through why that is. We have so very little intelligence on the North Korean regime that we don't know how many nuclear weapons they have. We don't know where they are all located. They've got mountains and rugged terrain there. They hide their weapons of mass destruction. We also know, according to different reports, they got 5,000 tons of chemical weapons, and they hide those as well. The Trump administration's stated goal is to denuclearize North Korea. You can't do that just with airstrikes, especially because we don't know where all their weapons are. You would need a large and bloody ground invasion to try to find those weapons and then to destroy them. And if we cannot locate them and destroy them before North Korea can retaliate, we're screwed. North Korea can detonate a nuclear weapon in or around South Korea, where we have not only millions of South Korean civilians, we also have US military bases and over 100,000 Americans. They could potentially launch a nuclear weapon at Guam or at Japan, again, where we have hundreds of thousands of Americans, US military bases, as well as millions of civilians. So that is one reason why there's no good military option, because we don't know how to contain escalation. We don't know if we just were to launch 59 cruise missiles, will North Korea do nothing, or they go berserk? And because we don't know that, it is extremely dangerous where we enter into a military conflict. But let's just take away the weapons of mass destruction part of it and just focus on conventional weapons. The North Korean military has this huge arsenal of conventional artillery, of rockets, of other devices that they can launch towards South Korea. 20 million people in South Korea are within range of their artillery. Estimates that have been reported are that in a full-out war on the peninsula, 20,000 people a day could die. Another report came out saying in a full-out war, over 2.1 million people could die, and 7.7 million people could be injured. That is why successive administrations, both Democratic and Republican, have not taken the military option, because they simply looked at the facts and concluded it would be a massive loss of life. So I'm not opposed to war, right? I'm still in the reserves, but I've been in the military, and philosophically, I'm not opposed to war. I am opposed to stupid wars, and also to wars that cause a large loss of life. And in North Korea, if you look at the history of it, in the first war, China and Russia came in for the North Koreans. We don't really know what they would do in a second Korean War. If China and Russia go in for North Koreans again, there's no reason to believe the US wins that war. In addition, we don't know how they would react. We don't know if escalation goes too high, if China and Russia would then feel compelled to do things against US military bases. Would our troops shoot at Russian troops or at Chinese troops? There's a whole mess of issues that this administration has not articulated nor explained. They have also not explained what happens after the shooting stops. North Korea has the knowledge to build nuclear weapons. They've got the knowledge to build ICBMs. They don't unlearn that knowledge. So to keep them from doing it again, we need to occupy that country, or South Korea. But someone has to occupy that country and make sure they don't do this again. We've been in Afghanistan for 16 years. We have not won yet. That is a far weaker country. So I don't know why the president thinks that we could even win a war in North Korea. Which means, to me, we need to exhaust every other option possible before trying to take the American people down this dark and bloody path of war. We need to look at economic sanctions. So I voted for the strongest economic sanctions ever on North Korea. The UN has imposed the strongest economic sanctions ever. We do need to give that some time to take effect. And then we need to look at diplomacy. Maybe it won't work, but at least we need to try it. There's been exactly 0 official talks between the North Koreans and the United States. But I believe we need to at least try everything possible before we start talking about war. And let me conclude by saying it is completely not helpful when the president does foreign policy on Twitter in 140 characters or less, especially when he undercuts his own Secretary of Defense. So you've got Secretary of Defense, and his Secretary of State. So both Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State have said they support diplomacy with North Korea, both of them. And then one day the president wakes up and on Twitter he basically says it's a waste of time. So that causes 2 huge problems. One, it's very confusing to us, to American people, to members of Congress, and to world leaders. And second, it basically just destroys the credibility of Rex Tillerson. So now when members of Congress or foreign leaders meet with Secretary Tillerson, we don't know who he's speaking for. Is he speaking for himself, or is he speaking for the president? Is what he says going to be undercut that very same day? We have no idea. And it makes it very, very difficult, I think, for the United States to operate that way. My hope is that the folks in the adult daycare center exert some more control. And let me just conclude with this rhetorical thought experiment. The president likes to say he wants to be sort of unpredictable and so on, and brash. So maybe in domestic politics you could try that. Really stupid in foreign policy, right? In foreign policy, you want to be clear. You don't want to have miscalculations. So how many of you would have wanted John F. Kennedy to have been unpredictable during the Cuban Missile Crisis? That's where we are now. Hopefully you will work to continue supporting this legislation. The New York Times today did another editorial on our bill, so I think we're getting traction and movement, and look forward to working with all of you on this small issue of trying to keep us alive. Thank you so much.